All right, it is now time to fangirl over the Brandon Sanderson second lecture, Promise, Progress, Payoff, Plot Theory. Very excited. I'm Nicole Wilbur. I am a writer and a huge fan of Brandon Sanderson's writing lectures at BYU, and this is going to be a little recap, dive deeper. Let's talk about some of the advice and how it relates to us and really get into it because it's such good stuff. You just want to talk about it all the time. So, the first thing we talk about in this lecture is big P plot versus little p plot, which is an interesting concept because usually I would think of your big P plot as being sort of the external, what characters are doing, and the little p plot, or the other plot, don't get confused, is the internal journey. But that is not how Brandon Sanderson is describing this. He's saying big P plot is your overarching narrative that answers the question, what's your book about? And the little p plot is the chapter by chapter progression that shapes the conflict, with little problems that add up to the big problem your characters will eventually solve. Now that's a very interesting one to me, and I like that. Like the acknowledgement that we have an overarching thing, but in every chapter, in every scene, we're going to have a different problem to solve, and all of the problems need to add up to our big P problem. And actually, I think that this comes very, very important into the point of the lecture, which is promise, progress, and payoff. Because it's almost like the big P plot is kind of your promise, and then the little p plot is your progress. Like the big P plot is your promise and payoff, and the little p plot is your progress that has to be working up towards the big P plot the whole time. So really enjoyed that. I love that advice. Let's go on to progress, promise, and payoff and talk about it. I've always thought that promises is a really great concept, but a hard one to almost to point out. It's hard to look at a book, a piece of writing, and say, this line is promising me something. I feel like if you did a super close reading, maybe you could kind of point that out. So I've tried to come up with some examples of promises. So Brandon talks about the different kinds of promises. He talks about tone promises and plot promises and character promises and all of that kind of thing, and how you do that in your opening to set up where the story is going to go. So for example, I pulled out a line from To Kill a Mockingbird. When he was nearly 13, my brother Jem got his arm badly broken at the elbow. That is a promise. That is a promise that we forget about, honestly, as you read the book a little bit, but it's that we're going to find out how his arm got badly broken at the elbow. I think a tone promise is like in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Pivot Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. The promise there is like a whimsy tone, but it's also they're not normal, that kind of thing. Bridgerton, I think, has a really good job at doing the promises for the other characters, and so seeding those into the different seasons. We have some promises for Benedict's character. We got the promise in Penelope's season for what Francesca's season is going to eventually be. Very right at the end there was a little hint, there was a little promise that was coming. A bigger example here is Narnia. So Narnia opens with fighting, with a war, and we're talking about the movie here, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And the opening to that, I have a video where I do the full breakdown of the opening scene. I'll link that above, which is why I went to this one, because I know it pretty well. But I think that opening provides a few promises to us. But it's not it's not one line you can point to, this is my promise. It's more everything all together. So what it is. So it is an action story. The opening is an action story, and this is an action story. There's going to be jeopardy, heart-raising tension, etc. So we open with what we're getting. Again, I think that's where Brandon jumped into talking about prologues and how often you'll have your little action prologue, or you'll have Indiana Jones doing the story in mini at the beginning to say, hey, this is what you're going to get. This is the promise we're giving you. Interestingly, although in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, we also have character promises. And I think these are very interesting how they're done. So in the opening, Lucy is in bed crying because there's an air raid going on. and Susan runs in, grabs her, and the two of them like kind of work together and like run out to the bomb shelter. Edmund and Peter are also running. Edmund and Peter are also running, and then Edmund turns around and runs back into the house. So he leaves the family, he ditches the family. Peter goes after him, grabs him, kind of saves him, and yells at him about being selfish. Just saying those aloud, if you know how the story goes, I mean, there's kind of a promise in there on Edmund is going to leave the family. Like, is that foreshadowing or is it is it the same thing? I'm not sure. But there are like the promises of the relationships. Like, you see this tension here. We're going to see development there. We see that there's, Lucy and Susan being, or at least Lucy being like kind of not cowardly. She's a child and there's an air raid, but, we see the potential for growth, and that potential for growth, I think, is a promise in and of itself. If we think of the end of this movie, we have Susan and Lucy going to Aslan and then being part of the rush of reinforcements, and we have Peter and Edmund leading the battle together, and Edmund risking his life and getting very, very hurt in order to save Aslan. So you see the different, like, night and day, right? So we see the progression when we compare the beginning to the end. Which brings me to the other thing that Brandon mentions, that I originally, like, he says it, and I'm like, are you sure about that? But he says that the best chapters have a stealth thesis paragraph, like what we learned in school of like your introduction, your middle, and your conclusion. A stealth thesis paragraph where they introduced what the chapter will be about and what you'll learn, and then they have a stinger of a line at the end that indicates you've actually learned it. And I was like, I feel like most books do not have a thesis paragraph at the start. And so I did a little bit of flipping, and I think he's right about it being stealth. There's almost like, and I wonder if the writers I'm about to talk about did this naturally or instinctively or on purpose, but at the very least, I see a lot of symmetry in chapters between the beginning and the end, if not like outright, oh, we're calling back. So I opened a bunch of random books to random chapters. So Percy Jackson and the Olympians, I opened it to chapter 9. The first line is, the next morning, Chiron moved me to cabin 3. The last line is, no time to waste, Chiron said. I think you should all get packing. So we see that, like, he's moved to the cabin. By the end of the chapter, he's leaving the cabin. We have new information. Is it groundbreaking? No, but it does kind of say, okay, we're setting up like a where we are in space kind of thesis there. K.L. Walter, her book, what's it called? If We Were Us. The first line of a random chapter is, after running into Luke and Sage at the movies, the night sped up and soon broke into fragments. That's even more so of a thesis paragraph, because it's like, okay, now we're going to see the fragments. I first remembered getting really drunk and breaking up with Val. And then the end, he's waking up, he's on a Chesterfield with a dry throat. A Chesterfield with a dry throat, just opening the thing here. Calling Sage, but she's not answering. He's underneath a comforter, and he notices a bottle of Advil and a Post-it note, and it says, you're a moron, in half print, half cursive. So we kind of got this is probably what the chapter is going to be about, and then we got the ending of it with like, oh, someone's calling him a moron. I found it in my own writing helpful to use the first couple paragraphs in a chapter to establish a goal for the characters. So reminding the audience, like, our goal is to steal this phone. Our goal is to trick this store manager. Our goal is to do X. Our goal is to break into this building. So like that is well established. And then at the end of a chapter, we usually get either like a line being like, we did it, or we didn't do it, or like we're in the middle of doing it and something is going terribly wrong, and doing kind of the zinger at the end there. So I think that is kind of what the thesis is. Like, sometimes it's about the symmetry, it's about pointing out or giving kind of a promise of what the chapter will be by kind of indicating some sort of theme or movement, or giving a little bit almost of like an overview, like that the night sped up and soon broke into fragments. Or it's like reestablishing your goal. That's promises. So then we talk about progress. And I love how Brandon talks about the different kinds of progress. Progress are the ways that the reader knows that the plot is progressing. You know, it's we're not just standing still. It's sometimes you read a book and you're like, nothing happened. Nothing happened in that book. Progress and signposting and progressing is how we try to make sure readers don't say that about our books. So he talks about types of progress. So he talks about mystery stories, where the progress is measured by clues being discovered and suspects being ruled out and mysteries slowly unraveling. I think A Good Girl's Guide to Murder does this really well. It always has these like notebook pages in the middle. And interestingly, these notebook pages end at like 75% when we're getting into the payoff. But she like has a list of suspects and she's literally crossing them out and like writing down the clues in this notebook so we can figure out the mystery together. There's also relationship progress. So this is where you have your initial conflict or misunderstanding, gradually kind of getting to an understanding. You're seeing the moments of connection, the moments of setback, and then you ultimately see it culminating in a climactic moment of connection. I also love how Brandon Sanderson's like, yeah, Bridgerton and like buddy cop story, same thing. Like every relationship will have these like pushes and pulls and stuff. I was also thinking like, what are other types of progress besides in a relationship? So where you have connection, setback, or a mystery. I think this is why journey stories are often so popular, because if you're like, we're going to this place on the map, and if you keep checking in on where you are on the map, you are getting closer to the thing. Like if you know you're going on a road trip, Percy Jackson from New York to California, I think Rick Riordan does a really good job of being like, and now we're in Indiana, and now we're in Nevada, like that kind of thing. There's also time progress. This is where ticking clocks can be very useful. Ideally, the characters will be doing something, but like some books will have a countdown, or we know there's this ticking clock going on at the same time. We can also have kind of related to mystery, but characters gaining information. So having the character think about new information, notice things, think about the information that they're lacking and try to puzzle it out as you go and see them make a little bit of progress from that. For my heist book, I have a literal checklist. Like my characters sit down at the start of Act 2 and they write a list of like five or six things that they need to do in order to steal the violin that they're stealing. And readers freaking love this checklist. Like I have great writing, I have like descriptions I've worked so hard over, and everybody is just like, oh, I really like the checklist. But they like it because you can see the progress as you go. You can clearly tell, okay. And then they have meetings where they go and check, and ooh, that's still a problem, and check. And everybody gets assigned an item on the checklist. It might be because I am very checklist oriented, but the readers really, really likes that because you can see that progress there. You also have character internal progress happening at the same time, where the character is questioning their beliefs, overcoming personal challenges, developing new understanding or skills. Now, one thing that Brandon didn't mention with this, but that I think is super, super relevant is decision making. So decisions are huge in progress, especially in the character internal journey area. I always like to talk about decisions in character arcs because character choices are the building blocks of character arcs. To give a crude example, like if my character starts off selfish and ends selfless, at the beginning we need to see her making selfish decisions, and at the end we need to see them making selfless decisions. They're making the same kind of choice over and over. And throughout the story, we see how their decision-making thought process, because it's a book, so we can see in their head, which is very helpful, but we can see how maybe before, like, they would make the selfish decision just, like, in an instant. But in the book, now they're questioning it a little bit, and they're wavering back and forth, and we can see their thought process changing. Eventually, the types of decisions and the choices they're making changing until we get to the big, like, character arc payoff at the end. For example, Devil Wears Prada, Andy starts out by choosing to work for Miranda, despite the job not really seeming like her and not seeming like a fit, but okay, whatever. And then we see her very early on, we see her choose to go to Chicago, the musical with her dad, instead of helping Miranda, because it's a job. But as the movie progresses, we see her really start to change. She's choosing work over family. She's choosing dressing like the runway girls over what she would normally wear. She's choosing work over a date. She's choosing work over friends. She's choosing work over Nate. And then she's choosing Paris over Emily. And we're just seeing this escalation of her choices, of the people in her life and the things that are important to her and core to her, her like moving them to the side in preference for work and Miranda, until there's her final choice where she decides to leave Paris. In the book, she says "F you, Miranda," which is, it's a great moment, and go home and back to her life. So those little bits are kind of all signposts where we're trying to show that progress is happening. And then we get into payoff, and there was a great kind of summary I think he gave on, you know, how like what is good payoff, and it's basically the balance between expectation and surprise. So it's the inevitable but surprising conclusion to the story, and it's really tricky because obviously, like in a romance, we know they're getting together. In Lord of the Rings, as you said, we are pretty sure Frodo's not going to die. We're pretty sure the world's not going to end. But still, we need to be surprised that they've accomplished the goal that we knew they were going to accomplish the whole time. So he mentions things about like create genuine doubt in whether they're going to get the goal or not. He talks about the moment, you know, where it looks like Sam might have to do the ring thing. The obstacles are real. Make the promise seem impossible. Use red herrings. Use escalations. You want to give readers just enough doubt that they're like, there's no way they can do this. How will they do this? And you want that ultimate resolution to feel earned, not cheap. He talks about, again, with Lord of the Rings, how in the second movie, there's a promise of Gandalf coming back, and so the payoff feels earned. But in the third movie, when things come in to save the day, it's kind of like, oh. So there, we're making the resolution feel earned by laying the right promises, by basically giving the characters the tools that they need to solve the final problem somewhere in the middle. And then either they're using the tools in a surprising way, or they're, you know, using a tool that they thought they wouldn't need, or something happens in how you get to that resolution. I think that's a big part of the surprise, right? It's how you get to that resolution that makes it feel earned and not cheap. And he does mention, you know, make sure you know the most important plot line and that your climax is paying that off. So if you have an adventure story with like a romance subplot, the climax should be the romance subplot. It should be the adventure. Ideally, all of these threads are kind of climaxing at the same time, but you know, that's really hard. So that was lecture number 2. This was such a good one. I love the promise, progress, payoff, even though I can't say it. I think it's a really great structure just for like even getting started with brainstorming too, and saying like, okay, like how are things going to change? What is the progress going to be? And going back and kind of mapping things out. Last week, my favorite quote from the lecture was, the product of your writing time is you. This week it is, I'm kind of throwing myself footballs and then trying to catch them 15 years later. Yes, you are, Brandon. Love that. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. Tell me your favorite quote or your favorite piece of advice from the lecture in the comments below. I will be back tomorrow with lecture number 3 because yes, we are catching up. We are catching up. At least it's like we have the exam tomorrow and we're trying to cram all our reviews in. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.